Welcome to session 202 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 21st of July. Today we'll be looking at Ezra 1 to 3 and Psalm 47. But first, let's get a bit of an overview of Ezra, and as we'll see, Nehemiah. We now enter the post-exilic writings. These writings were written after the exile. The first two are Ezra and Nehemiah. In our modern Bibles, Ezra and Nehemiah are separate books. However, the earliest copies we have were a single scroll. There is some debate amongst scholars whether they were originally separate by two different authors and then brought together as one scroll by a later editor. There's also some discussion around whether it's the same author or editor that wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, though neither of those are conclusive. Ezra starts roughly 50 years after the initial exile and depicts the story of a group of exiles returning from Babylon to the land to rebuild their community there. If we join Ezra and Nehemiah together, we read through 3 different leaders, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, as they lead the people to rebuild Jerusalem. Each leader is sent to Jerusalem by a Persian king and experience opposition while there. Here's a summary of the structure, but I'd recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are 2. We start with Ezra 1 to 6. Zerubbabel seeks to rebuild the temple. Ezra 7 to 10. Ezra seeks to strengthen the community and teach the Torah. Nehemiah 1 to 7. Nehemiah seeks to rebuild the city walls. Nehemiah 8 to 12. A fresh commitment to God. And then Nehemiah 13. It all falls apart. You may remember from Daniel 5:30 that Babylon was conquered by the Persians. While many Israelites were still in exile in Babylon, some moved into Persia and its capital city, Susa. We also get in Nehemiah one of the earliest mention of the Jews. The majority of the Israelites in exile in Babylon and Persia were from Judah and so became known as Jews. Similarly, over time, the Israelites from the northern kingdom returned to their land and they also take on a new name. They named themselves after their capital city, Samaria, and became known as the Samaritans. The post-exilic books seek to pick up the future hope that the pre-exilic and exilic prophets laid out. That God will establish a future king, see Isaiah 11 verses 1 to 10. That his presence will dwell in a new temple, see Ezekiel 40 to 48. That he will restore the kingdom, see Ezekiel 37 verses 21 to 28. And that kingdom will be over all nations to fulfill the promise he made to Abraham, see Genesis 12 and then Jeremiah 3 verse 17. But Ezra and Nehemiah in particular pick up what we read in Daniel, that the return from the exile won't be the moment that this all happens. That's Daniel 9 verse 25. Despite the leaders' best efforts, the flaws of the people flow through Ezra and Nehemiah ends in a place of disappointment. In short, these books pick up the future hopes as something they're still not seeing, but are looking forward to. So let's jump in with Ezra 1 to 3. Cyrus has just conquered Babylon as the king of Persia, and God comes to him and inspires him to send the Jews home to rebuild the temple. This is good news and should inspire in us hope. Many of the prophets we've read so far prophesied that God would bring his people back out of exile and return them to their land and rebuild the temple. This must be it. And so many of the Jews got up and headed back to their ancestral land. As they were leaving, some of the people in the land around them offered them up silver and gold as a gift to send them off. This is very similar to when God first brought the people out of Egypt, and the Egyptians gave them silver and gold as they left. Have a look at Exodus 12 verses 35 to 36. The difference here is that while the Egyptians gave out of fear, the people living in Babylon gave to bless the Jews. King Cyrus also made sure to give them all the gold, silver and artifacts that the kings of Babylon had stolen from the temple many years ago. We're experiencing here a second Exodus moment in Israel's history. God was once again leading his people out of a foreign nation and into the promised land. We then get a whole chapter of names of peoples and families that left Babylon to return to Jerusalem. To us, this may seem boring and unimportant, but to a people that were deeply attached to their ancestry, this was very important. God had protected them in exile. He had maintained their family lines and their sense of identity while in a foreign land. In total, including the servants that some of the people had acquired in Babylon, there were 50,000 people that returned to Jerusalem. Out of these people rose 2 men as clear leaders, Joshua and Zerubbabel. They realised that if the people are to succeed, then they need God with them, and so the very first thing they do is set up the altar so they could make their offerings. They reintroduce the regular feasts and festivals to realign the people with God and his ways. Then they gave the craftsmen the money and resources that Cyrus had given them so they could start building the temple. While the temple building was starting, Joshua and Zerubbabel gathered some of the Levites together and set them in charge of the temple to make sure everything was being done properly. What's noteworthy is that in Numbers 8 verse 24, the Levites had to be 25 before they could begin service. In fact, Numbers 4 verse 3 has that the Levites have to be 30, but tradition suggests that 25 was apprenticeship and then 30 was active service. The point is that here in Ezra, they accept all Levites who are 20 or older. One reason for this is because so few Levites remained, and so they had to recruit them younger to make sure they had enough. In other words, they alter the rules that are set out in the Torah to meet the needs of the time. As the builders finish their foundation, the priests and the Levites start to celebrate and praise God for his goodness. For many, seeing this initial foundation of the temple, this was a time of celebration. God was fulfilling his promise to his people. But to others, this wasn't the case. Some of the older men, who could just about remember the old temple and were wise enough to fully grasp what God had spoken over his people, were weeping. Looking at the foundation of this temple, it was nowhere near as grand as the old temple. It was also nothing like the temple that Ezekiel had prophesied about. And so we're left feeling a little cheated. This was meant to be the answer to God's promises. This was the thing that the people had been waiting on. But actually, maybe not. That is Ezekiel 1-3. Now let's look at Psalm 47. The psalm is attributed to the sons of Korah and falls into the category of praise psalm. It can also, however, fit into the category of royal psalm, as it recognises the rule and reign of God as king over all the earth. Here's a summary of the structure. We have verse 1, a call to praise. Verses 2-5, God is a victorious king. Verse 6, a call to praise. And then verses 7-9, God reigns over all the earth. The psalm opens with a call to praise God. What's interesting is that this call is to all peoples, Psalm 47 verse 1. This includes those who are non-Israelites. The reason they are to praise God is because he has subdued all nations underneath Israel. This may seem strange to us. Why would a nation who has been defeated by the Israelites want to worship their God? This was actually a fairly common practice. Just as when a people are conquered, they come under the authority of the conquering king. These people conquered by God through the Israelites are now under God's authority. From this, we see that Israel had a theology for the whole earth being reunited under God. They saw this coming through military conquest. Jesus' death and resurrection would ultimately come and wage war against the powers of death and sin and unite the earth under God. In many ways, the Israelites weren't wrong, but it wouldn't look like anything they had been expecting. The psalmist calls again for the people to praise God as their king, for he will reign over all nations. But now the idea is developed further. The people of different nations are not to remain subdued and conquered underneath Israel. They are to gather together before God, just as the Israelites do. In this psalm, we get to see the idea of God's kingdom and the uniting of all the nations here in the Old Testament. Two ideas that many people assume are unique to the New Testament. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.